An extraordinary moment unfolded within the monarchy, an event so unexpected that it sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, reverberating far beyond its gilded walls. This wasn't a carefully worded statement issued by a palace spokesman, nor a meticulously edited release designed to shield the family from the public's gaze. Instead, it was a single voice that pierced the stillness, a voice that had long been synonymous with discipline, restraint, and unwavering devotion to duty. When Princess Anne spoke, the weight of her words made it painfully clear. What was unfolding before them was far darker, far more catastrophic than anyone could have possibly imagined. Prince Louis's fate, sealed in silence, was now something the public could no longer ignore, and what had been hoped to remain hidden had come to light in the most jarring way. Before we explore the deeper and more profound implications of this moment for the royal family, it is crucial that you subscribe to stay updated, for this event marks the beginning of a new pivotal chapter in the monarchy's history. Anne's words weren't just shocking because of the volume or the manner in which they were delivered. It was the content itself that rattled the very core of royal tradition. Throughout her public life, Princess Anne had maintained a certain distance, a graceful, composed figure who had never been one to indulge in the emotional displays often expected of public figures. In moments of crisis, she had never been the one to offer soft, comforting words. Instead, she was the unseen force, the one holding everything together from the shadows, a calm presence while everything around her faltered. She was, by nature, the one who quietly stitched together the fraying fabric of the royal institution. But when Princess Anne spoke this time, it shattered the calm that had long held sway within the walls of Buckingham Palace. It was not just a breaking of royal protocol, it was the breaking of a profound silence that had become all too familiar. The words she spoke were raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. The rituals of royalty, those carefully crafted protocols designed to shield the family from public scrutiny, were gone, replaced by something far more urgent and far more real. The timing itself was unsettling. Why, at exactly 3 minutes past the hour? In the world of the monarchy, nothing is ever left to chance. Every moment is a carefully choreographed performance, and this disruption was glaring, impossible to ignore. The royal rhythm had been disturbed, and there was no going back. Experienced royal journalists, those who had spent their careers studying the nuances of palace statements, sat frozen in their seats. The pens they had been holding in midair faltered, and phones buzzed across the room with messages passed in urgent whispers. The truth began to spread, unspoken but understood. This was not the usual royal update. It wasn't a soothing reassurance meant to calm the public or address a minor issue. This was something far more serious, a revelation that could no longer be contained. Anne's tone confirmed it. There was no attempt to offer warmth, no comforting reassurances meant to soothe a worried public. Instead, there was finality in her voice, an unmistakable weight, a sense that the truth was no longer negotiable. The message wasn't one of hope, but one of resignation. Something had already been set into motion, and no amount of eloquence or formalities could reverse it. Her pauses, each one deliberate, seemed to stretch on as though she was giving the world time to absorb the full gravity of her words. With every silence, every omission, the absence of optimism seemed to grow louder. There was no mention of hope for the future. There were no comforting words to soften the blow. This wasn't the first of many difficult moments. This was the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. The nation, watching in stunned silence, held its collective breath. And within the minds of the listeners, one question reverberated, a question that held both fear and curiosity. Why had this moment arrived now of all times? Why was it Princess Anne, the one who so often remained in the background, speaking up now when others with more public voices, such as William, who was so often seen as the emotional core of the family, had not? Why had Catherine, whose warmth and compassion had guided the family through previous crises, not stepped forward? The simplicity of this response, the cold, unsettling nature of Anne's words, was what made the moment so impactful. It wasn't just a matter of timing, it was the stark reality that had been exposed. There was no room for sentimentality, no space for comforting words or gestures. This was a matter of immense gravity. Anne's voice, steady and unwavering, conveyed the sense that this was not a passing storm, not just a moment of crisis, but something that had long been inevitable. Anne had never allowed hers to falter, to tremble in the face of difficult truths. Her voice only shook when the ground beneath her had cracked open, when she understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the cost of what had happened. She wasn't speaking to buy time. Her words were carefully chosen, each one holding a weight that was too heavy to bear. They came from someone who understood that the consequences of what had happened were already in motion, irreversible and irrevocable. The moment she spoke, the world shifted. There was no going back. As the public absorbed Anne's message, the gravity of it sunk in. It wasn't just a royal announcement, it was the beginning of something far larger, something that would change the course of the royal family's history. And the public was left to wonder, how had it come to this? How had something so catastrophic occurred within a family that was meant to be the epitome of stability? And what would come next? This question of why now lingered long after the final words had been spoken. Why had the palace waited so long to address the issue of Prince Louis? Why had the family chosen silence over action? What had the royal family, in its quest for perfection, allowed to fall through the cracks? These questions would plague the nation as it waited for answers that might never come. But Princess Anne's response was swift and unsettlingly simple. This was not a moment for sentimentality. This was a gravity moment. Her voice, typically steady and composed, didn't falter unless the ground beneath it had already cracked open. She wasn't buying time. Her words weren't designed to reassure the public, to soften the blow, or to assuage their fears. No, these were the words of someone who had seen the consequences of silence before, and who understood that what had happened could never be undone. This wasn't just a difficult truth, it was an irreversible one. And once Anne had spoken, it was clear, the world had shifted. The foundation of the royal family, so long unshaken, had been fractured, and there was no going back. For decades, the monarchy had maintained its carefully constructed facade of unshakable strength and stoic grace. Every public moment, every gesture had been meticulously orchestrated to project an image of stability, to reinforce the institution's unyielding power. But now, with one voice, Anne had shattered that illusion. There would be no more pretending, no more hiding behind formalities or polite distance. The truth had been laid bare, and its weight was suffocating. The hush that followed was not just the quiet after a statement, it was the silence of realization. A profound understanding spread through the room, the gravity of Anne's words sinking in. There was something larger at play here, something far more significant than anyone had imagined. This was not the end, but the beginning of a much larger story, one whose consequences would echo for years to come, shaping not just the royal family, but the monarchy itself. It was a moment that marked the end of an era of complacency and the dawning of an era of reckoning. The royal family, for the first time in generations, was facing a crisis far more personal, more deeply rooted than any they had experienced before. This was no longer about maintaining appearances. This was no longer about managing a carefully curated image. This was a moment of raw truth, a confrontation with the consequences of a culture that had long prioritized duty, tradition, and image over the well-being of its own members. And once that truth had been spoken, there was no denying it. But to truly understand the weight of Princess Anne's words, we must first look back to the months leading up to this fateful moment. Behind the carefully guarded walls of Buckingham Palace, a subtle unraveling had begun long before Anne's voice ever reached the public's ears. Prince Louis, once the brightest spark of joy in the royal family, had started to fade from public view. The smiles that had once been a staple of his appearances, those moments of innocence and wonder, had been replaced with an eerie silence. His absence wasn't just a physical one, it was emotional, a quiet retreat that no one seemed able to explain, but everyone felt. For months, the palace had used strategic absences and half-statements, carefully crafting the illusion of normalcy. Where there should have been concern, there were only smiles, plastic, forced, and empty. Where there should have been open conversations, there was only silence. And as the months passed, the question that had once lingered at the edges of everyone's thoughts became impossible to ignore. What had happened to Louis? What was being hidden behind the palace's tight-lipped facade? The royal family was not hiding the truth for the sake of privacy. No, they were withholding it because the truth had no words. The damage had already begun long before anyone outside the palace walls could have known. Inside Buckingham Palace, something was falling apart piece by piece. The royal communication machine, once known for its elegant precision, had begun to show signs of strain. Public statements became shorter, more vague, less frequent. And the name of Prince Louis, once an essential part of every family update, became increasingly absent from the public eye. The family had once been the embodiment of a public image of perfection, a model for the nation. Every royal engagement, every family moment was an opportunity to reinforce that image. But over time, the cracks had started to show. Louis's absence from public life was not just the result of a family seeking privacy. It was a sign that something much deeper, much more troubling was taking place behind closed doors. The silence surrounding him spoke volumes, louder than any statement could. The royal family was in crisis, and no amount of carefully orchestrated appearances could mask the truth. The absence of Louis wasn't just a temporary blip on the royal radar. It was a deep, unsettling silence, one that spoke to a much larger problem. For the public, it was easy to believe that the family simply wanted privacy, that the absence was nothing more than a temporary reprieve from the spotlight. But for those who understood the inner workings of the monarchy, it was clear something was breaking. The absence of Louis was not just a quiet withdrawal. It was an active erasure of a child who had once been a symbol of hope and joy. And the family's refusal to address it directly only made things worse. Each carefully worded statement, each evasive silence only served to deepen the mystery. It wasn't that they were protecting Louis from the public eye, it was that they were protecting themselves from the truth. They were protecting themselves from facing what had already been set in motion, from admitting the cracks in the family's armor. The more the palace tried to maintain its image of unity, the more the cracks began to widen. What had once been the royal family's greatest strength, their ability to remain composed in the face of scandal, was now their greatest weakness. The public could see it, the insiders could feel it, and as the silence continued, the question grew more urgent. How long could they keep this up? How long could they hide the truth before it all came crashing down? Anne's words were a painful acknowledgement of what had been allowed to fester in the shadows for too long. The story that was now unfolding was not just about one royal child's disappearance, it was about the monarchy itself, and whether it could survive the unraveling of its own carefully constructed image. The truth, once hidden in silence, had finally begun to surface, and with it came the realization that there was no turning back. The royal family could no longer hide behind silence or evasive half-truths. The unraveling had begun, and its consequences would reach far beyond Prince Louis. The monarchy, once a symbol of strength and stability, was now facing the very real possibility of falling apart at the seams, and there was no way to stop it. Once Anne had spoken, once the truth had been laid bare, there was no longer any pretense. The truth was undeniable, and it was now a matter of how the family would face it. Would they continue to hide to avoid the difficult conversations to maintain the illusion of perfection, or would they face the consequences of their actions and begin the long process of rebuilding what had been broken? Whatever happened next, one thing was clear: the monarchy would never be the same. It was not what had been said, but what had been omitted that raised suspicions. The glaring absence of Louis's name from public events, the conspicuous lack of even the smallest photographs of him, and the careful, deliberate avoidance of certain words all painted a chilling and undeniable picture. In the realm of royal diplomacy, it wasn't about reassurance or maintaining a composed facade. No, in this case, diplomacy was used as a tool for evasion, a means of deflecting and sidestepping uncomfortable truths. To the outside world, it appeared as though the royal family simply needed privacy, a brief respite from the public eye. But for those who knew how to read between the lines, it became painfully clear: something far darker was unfolding. The silence was not peaceful, it was calculated, a quiet strategy meticulously orchestrated to hide a truth that could no longer be denied. But the cracks in this strategy were beginning to show. Inside the palace walls, the weight of maintaining this silence was starting to break them all down. The illusion of control that the monarchy had carefully upheld for centuries was beginning to disintegrate. Some advisors, desperate to preserve the family's image, argued that honesty would only create chaos, unraveling everything the royal family had worked to protect. Others believed that continuing down the path of silence would be their ultimate undoing. Temporary withdrawal was suggested, but that term was quickly rejected. It was far too optimistic and ultimately dishonest. There was no withdrawal, the damage had already been done. The rare public appearances of Louis over the past months had now taken on new, haunting significance. The once charming expressions, so full of youthful joy, now seemed forced, almost rehearsed. His playful, mischievous nature, once a source of delight, was now a mask hiding something far more troubling. The signs were there for anyone willing to see them. What had once been light and full of life now felt like an act, a performance that no one could sustain forever. And it wasn't just the public that noticed. Those within the palace, those closest to the family, had seen these changes long before the world caught on. The long silences in conversation, the hesitation before public appearances, the last-minute cancellations of events all pointed to the same conclusion. The cracks in the royal family's armor had become too wide to ignore. But acknowledging the problem, admitting that something was deeply wrong, was not just difficult, it was dangerous. To address the issue head-on would mean shattering the very image they had worked so hard to build. It meant facing the ugly reality that not all was well within the walls of Buckingham Palace. There were reputations to protect, legacies to uphold, and images to preserve. And yet, despite all the precautions, something was slipping away. The carefully curated public persona of the royal family, so pristine and untouchable, was no longer enough to shield them from the truth. The toll of maintaining the silence, of protecting the carefully crafted facade, had begun to take a devastating emotional toll on those closest to Louis. It was no longer about protecting him from the public eye. No, the palace had long since stopped protecting Louis. Instead, they were protecting themselves from the unbearable truth of what had happened, of what was still happening. They had tried to keep him safe from the prying eyes of the world, but in doing so, they had isolated him. They had created a space where he could no longer thrive, a stifling silence that left him no room to grow. And then one night, after months of maintaining this crushing silence, the walls came crashing down. William, alone with Catherine, turned to her, his voice heavy with the realization that had been gnawing at him for so long. With quiet sorrow, he muttered, "We thought we were helping." The weight of those words hung in the air, thick with regret and unspoken fear. There was no immediate response from Catherine. What could she say? The words had already been spoken, and there was no turning back. The bubble that had protected them for so long, the carefully constructed illusion that they were in control, that they had the situation in hand, had burst. The truth was no longer something they could hide from, and with it, the illusion that they could control what was happening to their son had dissolved. The silence that had once shielded them from the world's judgment, the silence that they had thought would protect Louis, had now become their greatest burden. The emotional weight of that realization was crushing. The royal family had tried so hard to keep up the appearance of normalcy, to shield the world from the cracks beneath their surface, but now those cracks were impossible to ignore. They had failed. They had failed Louis. They had failed each other. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. Protecting Louis from the world had, in fact, trapped him in a space where no one could reach him. They had tried to preserve the monarchy, to preserve the family image, but in doing so, they had allowed something much more devastating to happen: the loss of a child, the loss of their own humanity, buried beneath a wall of royal duty and public expectation. The truth that had been buried for so long was no longer avoidable. For Princess Anne, who had witnessed similar tragedies in the past, the weight of history pressing down upon her became too great to ignore. She had seen what happened when emotion was buried beneath duty, when the royal family's unshakable commitment to image and tradition silenced the cries for help. She had seen the toll of when a child's quiet suffering was mistaken for strength, for resilience. Anne knew the cost of pretending everything was fine, of keeping up appearances at the expense of the truth. And this time, she refused to stand by and watch history repeat itself. She could no longer be a passive observer tucked away in the shadows of royal tradition. Princess Anne did not ask for permission to act. She didn't wait for approval from palace advisors. She didn't weigh the optics or the long-term legacy of her actions. When she realized that Prince Louis was slipping further away, when it became impossible to deny the gravity of what was happening to him, she took matters into her own hand. Anne called William directly, bypassing the formality and pomp that typically governed royal conversations. She didn't speak to him as a member of the royal family. She spoke to him as a sister, desperate to break the silence, desperate to force the truth into the open. The conversation they had, though never officially recorded, would prove to be the moment everything shifted. Those who saw William afterward knew it immediately. It had altered everything. Anne's words carried the weight of someone who had seen this before, someone who understood that if they didn't face the truth now, it would destroy them all. And when Anne spoke, the world felt it. This wasn't just another royal statement or carefully measured comment. This was a declaration, a breaking of the pattern of silence that had dominated the monarchy for so long. This was Anne refusing to let history repeat itself, refusing to allow the palace to continue hiding behind carefully constructed facades and half-truths. She understood the magnitude of what she was doing, and she understood the consequences. The institution she had spent her entire life serving was finally being forced to confront its greatest weakness, its silence. Her words carried authority, not because they offered comfort, but because they brought recognition. Recognition of a problem that had long been ignored, a problem that could no longer be swept under the royal rug. The silence that had once been the monarchy's shield, its protective armor, had now become its greatest vulnerability. The public's expectation of perfection had stripped away the humanity of those involved, and the cost of that perfection was now laid bare for everyone to see. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, its centuries of history, was still a family bound by blood, but also by its own imperfections and fragility. The royal family's carefully constructed image of unity, of perfection, had always been just that, an image. Beneath it was a family struggling with its own internal battles, its own unresolved tensions. And in that moment, when Anne, the most disciplined and stoic voice in the royal family, chose to speak, she reminded the world that history does not wait for the perfect moment to break. Sometimes it breaks in the most unexpected of ways, at the most unexpected of times. This is not just another royal crisis, this is a turning point. The crown has weathered abdications, scandals, and heartbreak before, but this moment, this revelation, is different. It is not simply about one royal child's fate. It is about the institution's very survival, about whether it can adapt to a new world, to a world that can no longer tolerate silence in the face of suffering. What happens next will determine whether the monarchy can evolve, whether it can come to terms with the reality of its own fragility, or whether the silence that once protected it will ultimately prove to be its downfall. Stay with us, because when the quietest royal breaks her silence, it is a sign that history is already shifting. And once history shifts, there is no turning back.